Welcome back for part 2 of Classifying Organisms. We're going to begin today by discussing scientific naming. You may have noticed when you've read a scientific book or article that organisms are sometimes referred to by long, sciencey, difficult to pronounce names that are different than the common name you might typically use to identify the organism. Well, that long, sciencey sounding name is what we call the organism's scientific name, which was created using the system of binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature is a two-word scientific naming system that scientists use to identify all species. And as you might have guessed, binomial nomenclature uses the Latin language. If you pick apart this vocabulary term, you may notice that the prefix bi means two, and you may have noticed also that the root nome, especially if you take Spanish, you have seen this root in the word nombre, means name. So binomial literally means two names, and then the word nomenclature just means naming system. So binomial nomenclature literally means two-word naming system. So we've got an example here of a scientific name named with binomial nomenclature. Here, the word Smilodon californicus, which is the scientific name for the organism in the background of the slide. The two words that make up the name each have their own purpose. The first name indicates the genus to which the organism belongs, and the second name indicates the species. It also gives you descriptive information about the species. So, before we go further, let's review what the terms genus and species mean. You may remember these from yesterday when we discussed the taxa of modern classification. And you saw that genus and species were the smallest, most specific taxa. A genus is simply a group. Oops, do I have this out of order? Oh, no, I don't. A genus is simply a group of similar species, which then begs the question, what is a species? A species is a group of organisms that are capable of breeding and producing fertile offspring. So we went over this a little bit in class, but let me remind you that what this means is that for two kinds of organisms to be considered part of the same species, they must be able to make babies that can then grow up and make more babies of their own. The science word for that is to be fertile. So for example, both dogs and wolves are considered part of the same species because a wolf and a dog could have puppies that grow up to be adults and then could then have more puppies. In contrast, a horse and a donkey are similar enough to be placed in the same genus, but they are not part of the same species because their offspring, which you may be familiar with as a mule, is sterile. That is, it cannot have its own babies. Okay, back to our Smilodon californicus example. This organism goes by the common name saber-toothed cat. Now, before I go on, I want you to notice a few more details about binomial names. The first is that the genus name is always capitalized. You can see the capital letter. The species name is always lowercase. And both words are italicized. Okay? So italicized means written in these kind of slanted letters or cursive letters. When writing scientific names, please follow these rules. So, writing scientific names using binomial nomenclature may seem like just a way to make everything more complicated, but in reality, scientific names are actually very useful for simplifying and organizing information for scientists. This can be summarized in 3 points. 1, scientific names help us avoid mistakes when discussing organisms. For example, I may be reporting the results of my scientific study on the habits of saber-toothed cats, and perhaps I did my research on a very specific type of saber-toothed cat that you see at the top here, our Smilodon californicus. But if when I'm reporting my findings, I simply use the common name saber-toothed cat, I might be confusing my colleagues because there are several types of saber-toothed cats. They may be envisioning Smilodon populator, while I may actually be referring to Smilodon californicus. Second, scientific names tell us about the relatedness of organisms. For example, with no other information than their names, I can tell that Smilodon californicus and Smilodon populator are closely related because they share enough in common to have the same genus name. Finally, scientific names can give us descriptive information about the organism. That's the bell. Sorry, guys. For example, I can learn just from the meanings of their names that Smilodon californicus once roamed prehistoric California, while Smilodon populator were much greater in number and roamed a wider range on multiple continents. I can also figure out, for example, if I know a little bit of Latin, that an organism such as Crocodilus acutus has sharp pointed features because the word acute in Latin means sharp, or that the oyster, Ostrea edulis, is edible or okay to eat. Okay, the last topic I want to cover today is the concept of phylogenies. An organism's phylogeny is a description of how that organism is related to other organisms through the process of evolution. We can depict this relationship, which exists between all organisms on the planet, using a phylogenetic tree like the one you see here. So I want you to study this tree for a second and notice a couple things about it. First, phylogenetic trees show how one organism is related to another, just like your family tree would show how you are related to your siblings, your cousins, and so on. Second, phylogenetic trees imply that different species can arise from common ancestors. So in the same way that your family tree shows that you and your cousin share ancestors in common, such as your grandparents, a phylogenetic tree, like the one pictured here, shows that, for example, mammals and fish can arise from common ancestors. Trace these back. We can see that at some point the branches of their phylogenetic tree meet. Now, these lines represent millions of years. Okay, so it's not like your family tree, which may represent a couple of decades. These represent millions of years in time. But we can trace their lineage back millions of years and see that the common ancestor organism between these fish and the mammals had a vertebral column. Another thing to notice is that the closer two animals are on a phylogenetic tree, the more recently they have shared a common ancestor. And thus, they are more closely related. For example, this phylogenetic tree indicates that mammals are related to amphibians, and they're related to sea sponges. But since mammals share an ancestor with amphibians more closely, more recently, in time than the ancestor that they share with sea sponges, which is really all the way back here. It is then correct to say that mammals are more closely related to amphibians than they are to sea sponges. Now, aside from all of this being really super fascinating and awe-inspiring, why are phylogenies important to biologists? Well, modern taxonomy is based on phylogenies. That is to say, yesterday when we looked at all those DNA and structural and developmental and ancestry clues, what scientists really use those for is to determine the organism's relationships through evolution. And then from those relationships, the taxonomists can decide how best to classify the organism. Okay, that's all for tonight. We will look at dichotomous keys in class tomorrow or the next day. So don't worry that we haven't written anything on that slide. Don't forget to take your Quizmodo to check for your comprehension, and I'll see you tomorrow, Fiona and Mary Kate and Mary Catherine and everybody else who asked for a shout out. All right, see ya.